not retiring, but really changing, evolving, and growing, and moving into, the next phase.
Question. I have not retired. I have evolved into a new role. I'm now a new dad, and every day I become a new dad, and even a new granddad after that. So if we're being clear, I don't talk to myself. I talk with myself. It's been a lifetime since my last confession. Question we're answering today: what is the hardest part about retiring from a role I successfully played for over 2 decades? To be clear, that role that we're talking about is being a fatherhood. I think it's a role that a lot of us don't have good training on. The training program is sort of OJT a lot of the times on the job training. It's, the example of our own fathers that we follow or other fathers in our lives that we see. That could include, television shows, could be Damon Wayans on My Wife and Kids. It could be Bill Cosby. It could be, any number of different examples of, fathers that you see and you kind of either pick up on or work against sort of those visions, those images that you see. So, you might see the way that Bill Cosby acts on The Cosby Show and think that some of those qualities that he had, the way that he treated his family, the way he treated his kids, might be similar to the way you want to father your children. You might see your own examples of your own father, and maybe you think that's the father you want to be, or maybe that's the father you don't want to be. So I think as we kind of step into these roles as parents in general, we don't always have a great amount of training. You might be reading the Dr. Spock manual to parenting and raising children. You might have no manual. You might just be kind of winging it. So I think that's a role that is generally, if you feel like you've got to the point where you're doing it well, it's been hard fought. It has not been easy for you to get from, no experience to being experienced enough to handle your children. And I think it's a role that is different for every child you have. There's definitely some baseline things that you need to kind of know, some baseline things you have to kind of learn, but every child is different, and being a father to every child is different. So that becomes multiple jobs, multiple positions you're learning over a lifetime. And you get to wherever your, fatherhood finish line is, or it's not even really a finish line, it's more of a line in the sand that you cross, and then you make another line in the sand, and you have more job to do. And that job is constantly shifting and constantly changing. And it becomes a huge part of who you are and your life. And it's a practice, probably is more a better way to put it, a practice rather than a role, right? Like the same way lawyers or doctors are constantly in a practice. You're learning as you kind of go along and figuring it out. So at some point, that practice is lessened in your life, right? It may be when the kids go off to college, maybe when the kids move out the house. We all have kind of different times and points when each particular child kind of feels like they're, I guess, strong enough and independent enough to kind of, live their life without as much of your guidance as a father. For some kids, it might be 30 years old, just, however it kind of works out when they kind of learn that maturity to kind of exist a little more without your presence in their life in that way. But your presence is kind of always there, right? There's always a job to be done. So like the way I kind of look at it is, my father would always say when we were growing up, like, once you're 18, you're on your own, you're out the house, time to go get it and go get it done. And that wasn't like a real thing. It was definitely sort of a running joke. But like if we needed support past the age of 18, he always had us. So it wasn't like that, but it was also the mindset he was trying to put into us of like, you will need to be independent at some point. My job as a father will be done a lot, at some point. And you're going to have to kind of start figuring things out on your own. So I'm at the point now where I am, my sons are really starting to figure things out on their own. My oldest son, he's married and he's starting his journey as a father now. I'm a granddad. So like he's already, beginning his journey into figuring out what that looks like for him and his one son now and any future kids that might come along. My youngest son is in college and working his way through like being independent for a large part of his life. So like I don't need to have as much input in his life. But no, there's still, I think that tie, that connection is still there in a lot of ways. There's still like, something's going wrong at school. He wants to call mom and dad, and, we may not come to us for a solution, but he may come to vent. And again, that's part of your role as a father, right? Like things kind of change where you're not necessarily the one that has to come in and fix things, but you become the one that has to, be a shoulder to cry on. Maybe if things get bad enough, you have to kind of step in and do help in some way, financially, emotionally, physically, whatever it is. But that changing role for me has been interesting in a lot of ways, I think. If I were to grade myself as a father, I'd maybe be a C+ dad at the end of the day. My kids are happy and healthy. It wasn't always easy to get them there. It wasn't always easy to figure out what I needed to do for these two boys that are completely different from each other, kind of polar opposites in a lot of ways, and trying to figure out like how to deal with, the child who's smart and thinks he knows everything and doesn't want help. And the child who always wants help and has anxiety and ADHD and has a hard time focusing and is, quote unquote, maturing slower. But like, everybody's kind of on their own timetable. That's one of the things you learn as a father is that if you have multiple children, they all need individual attention. They all need to they have to have their own different fathers in a way. So getting to the point where like, I don't think I have to be as different of a father now as maybe I did in the past. They're both kind of independent enough where I can approach them in maybe similar ways of like just being a support system from afar, and not having to be so tied into every small decision or big problem, small problem that's kind of coming along. You can kind of jump in as needed as when they kind of help and request for your help. So that's a change for sure. It takes a lot of pressure off of you. It takes a lot of impact off of, your wallet for sure, your finances for sure, your mental space, your emotional space is a lot freer. I think there are things that you kind of looked for as signposts in their life, that expectations that are coming, they get, the girlfriend and, the wife or the fiance and then the children. So like right now I'm just getting prepared for certain milestones. So like, after my oldest son got married, waiting for the grandchild, now the grandchild's here. And what does life look like as a grandfather versus a father? And like, what kind of grandfather do I want to be? And that's a whole nother journey of, trying to figure out, what does this particular grandchild need versus what another grandchild might need. So that cycle of being a father in a lot of ways constantly ends and begins again. It ends and begins again. It's never just sort of like a completely done kind of a thing. So I think that's maybe the biggest thing I'm kind of thinking about is, how do I want to evolve into the next version of dad, and what does that look like? And I think for me, at this point in my life, I want a lot less responsibility of other people. I love to take care of myself and my wife and, nobody else. Like Jackie's like, oh, maybe we should get a dog or something. Like, I don't even want a dog. Like, I don't want to have to take care of anybody else. I'm good with just us for right now. So that's a, interesting place to be. To me, it's a happy and a thankful place to be that, they can be supported on their own and they don't have to come to me and I don't have to be a support system for them in that way. As you become a grandfather, that job also probably entails training your children to be fathers. And part of that goal is, I always wanted to be a better father than my father was. And hopefully my sons have that same goal. And I've tried to instill that in them as well to, just be better than I was, do the things that maybe I didn't do or the things I was missing, fill in those gaps for your children. So hopefully, as generations over generations come along, we are bigger and better and stronger family units as we, progress our family down the line. So part of that is like, part of my job now is to train up my sons to be, better fathers. And that's going to be a difficult job too, because I have, one son who is very much on book knowledge and he's like, yeah, the recommendations are this and this and this. And this book says you got to do it this way and that way. And like, as somebody who's gone through it and understanding that, books and recommendations are all great. They give you a great foundation. But like once you get in the trenches and have to deal with your child in this situation and it's not in, chapter 4, page 18 in this book, you can't go look up that situation for your child. It's one specific thing, right? So like, when my son, who's becoming a father now, when he was younger and came home from, shoplifting at the Walmart, stealing Pokemon cards, and it's like, I've never had any problems with you like this before, and now this is the new thing I have to deal with, of like, how do I deal with you in this situation when you are doing something that's so out of your ordinary right now? So there's always a situation that you're just not going to be prepared for. And as, life and society progresses, he has to deal with, a culture that was raised on computers and phones and all the baggage that comes along with that. The same way I deal with like my younger son, who, because of growing up and seeing things on Instagram, and you see all your favorite people just do things instantly, and it seems like they didn't put in any work, but for some reason are reaping all these rewards and benefits. And you think that's the way life is, and like once you get out there and really understand what life is really about, you understand that like they're not just appearing out of nowhere. Like everyone is working, whether you see the work or not. So like I never had a thought that I would have to think about my children not wanting to put in effort, or not thinking that effort was needed in order to get results. And that's something that, may not be in a book somewhere. Maybe it is in a book. Maybe I didn't read that one. So there's always something, new to kind of figure out with each generation as life on this planet evolves and society evolves and just the way we interact with each other evolves. So there's going to be things that, my sons are going to have to understand from their children that I would never have to deal with. And I probably will be pretty thankful that I never had to, as I'm sure my parents feel the same way about some of this themselves. I grew up in a time where, you got home from school, you went outside and you played outside. A lot of times kids aren't playing outside as much anymore. They're inside on a computer playing video games or watching the phone or what have you. And all that just trickles down in different ways that you have to then worry about these different types of influences that are, coming up on your child. So there's a constant learning curve to being a parent. And that job is never ending. So am I really retiring from a role? In a way, yes. Retiring from a version of a role. But that role is ever changing. You always have to be ready. And I think there's something I kind of talk about. I don't even know where I got this from. Probably somewhere, some guru on, YouTube or social media somewhere. But like there's the things that you bring to a position are not the things that are going to get you to the next level, right? So like if you're at a job and you're, junior designer, if you want to get up to, mid-level designer, the skills that got you to junior are not going to be enough. You have to kind of learn new skills to get to mid-level. If you have to learn new skills to get to senior, you have to learn new skills to get to principal. If you want to go into the management track, like there's always this leveling up that needs to happen. So like you think you come to this position with all these skills, like, yeah, I'm ready. And you get in that position, you understand that all those skills you have are kind of worthless. You add this new set to it for it to be valuable. And I think parenting's the same way, right? Like you have to learn how to deal with that 12, 13, 14-year-old. You got to learn how to deal with that 15, 16-year-old. And then that 17, 18-year-old and that college student and that, first job person, like that newlywed son you got to learn how to deal with. And the new father son you got to learn how to deal with. So there's never an end to it. It's just a different graduation, a different new set of skills you have to bring in. But I think in opposition to kind of the workplace example I gave, it's probably a lessening of skills as it goes up. It's a different skill set, but it's not as hard. I think it does get a little bit easier as you go through the different levels, rather than at work. I think it probably gets harder every level you go up. So I am appreciating that ease of this new level, and the ease of hopefully the levels to come. But life is going to throw you surprises one way or the other. So, those levels to come might not be as easy as I might think. So yeah, I have not retired from my role. I have evolved in my role. Have I ever been a star in my role? I don't know. Maybe I can be a better star in the future roles that I have ahead of me. So maybe I can get from a C+ dad to a B- dad at that level. Maybe my granddaddy is, A+ rather than being C+ dad. The granddad is probably a whole lot easier job to be than dad is, I'm sure. It's a lot more fun at times because you can spoil those kids and send them right back home to mom and dad, and they can have to deal with all the spoiling that you've done to them. So yeah, that would be my answer to that question. I have not retired. I have evolved into a new role. I'm now a new dad, and every day I become a new dad, and even a new granddad after that. So it's been fun and will be fun.
I don't talk to myself. I talk with myself. It's been, when I think about it, this is my first confessional. So, what is the hardest part about retiring from a role that I've been successful at for over 2 decades? The role is motherhood. So, the role of being a mother, in my honest opinion, and as I think about it and, just chit chat within my own mind, you never retire from that. It just changes. They change, the children change, the demands change, and how often they call you change, how often you see them changes, and their height changes, their needs change. And but it's really been a precious journey to see them go from little boys to becoming friends and soccer practice and soccer games and all of the things, going to church together, teaching them how to cook as best I can. It's hard to peg down somebody who wants to go outside and play all the time. Teaching them how to drive and teaching them about girls and life and taking them on field trips and family trips and, talking about life and all the things. And then I think the best word for and thoughts that I'm having as I mull this over is not retiring, but really changing, evolving, and growing, and moving into, the next phase, when now they stretch you from being mom to mommy, to bruh. Now, even the role in my title changes. Now I'm mother-in-law and future mother-in-law and grandma. It's really precious to see that it changes to change on top of change. So now I no longer need help with getting dressed and traversing high school and college and first jobs, second jobs, and all these things, and help planning a wedding and then getting married. Now it's, grandchildren and futures and it is awe-inspiring, and for me it's really been beautiful because my sons they're really, really great guys. They're really lovely young men, and they're smart and they're thoughtful and caring and, really have a true love and passion for people, and they want to do their best, they work hard, and they are some of the least needy guys I've ever met in my life. A lot of children, they stay so attached in a way where parents aren't able to flex into those new roles of in-law, grandparenthood, but even just to be a parent of a mature person, and an aging person who happens to be mature is really, really lovely. Just being able to call them and just say, hey, shoot the breeze, plan a trip, and they can get themselves there. they can get themselves back. They can afford to make these trips, make plans, whether it's driving or flying. They understand the importance of having their passport. I mean, it's really cool to have aging, mature children and be able to, like I said, flex into that space of, the next level. It's so lovely and so fun, we get back together and stuff, and we're renting a space and sharing a space. They revert back into their old ways, they karate chopping and kicking each other. But at the end of dinner, they jump right into the kitchen, they're clearing stuff away. Go to the store, they're putting stuff in the cart, they're buying it, putting it on the conveyor belt, purchasing it, bag it up, unpacking. Like, where are these guys forever ago, right? But you see, I could see the maturation. I could see how they are able to traverse life and really make a way. And it has really been special. So, as I really think about that, I haven't really retired from that role at all. I am still their mom. I love being a mother. I absolutely adore being a grandmother. And now it's, okay, how can I now take everything that I've learned and everything that I'm still learning, right? Because I'm always going to be a student until the day I die. And how can I share that information with them, that it respects them, and is it, pushy, but just sharing with them my experiences. And so hopefully, they can take it and, and understand what it is I'm trying to impart on them, and and use it for their good, because like I've always told them, it really isn't necessarily for me, though at the end of the day, at the end of a decade or a few years, I am going to want that return on my investment. But for real, it's for you. So if I'm giving you some wisdom and some knowledge and understanding of things that I've experienced in life, it's for you. So and for your day-to-day, because I've already done that. I've already gone through the teething season. I've already gone through it, so it's really for you. So yeah, I am loving this. There was a time, and I think many of us have heard, 18 grown and gone, or grown and gone, and all that. I don't live by that. I want to continue to be an important part of my children's lives. I want to always be there and accessible and help. And when I think about it, I want to be there so that, like, we really can enjoy the next phase of life. Because as much as I want, to be there, if they're anything like me, and when, I was a young mother and raising them, they gonna need grandma. And it's also a blessing to be there as a grandmother with your grandchildren. So, it just, the cycle goes. So I don't see it as a final chapter. I don't see it as retiring, closing a chapter on being a mother. Never, ever, ever. I'm a mother until the day I die. And I am Zay and Miles' mom. And I am forever grateful for that. And I'm also Calvin's grandma. I'm forever humbled by that. I'm finished.